Christina of Sweden entered the world in December 1626, under the chilling circumstances of a false hope. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, had desperately longed for a male heir to cement the future of the nascent Swedish Empire. When the infant was born, a mistaken announcement reportedly proclaimed a boy to the court, only for a midwife to correct the news. The disappointment was so profound that Gustavus immediately resolved to raise Christina as though she were a son. What followed was one of the most unorthodox royal upbringings in early modern Europe. She was trained in statecraft military theory, classical languages, and philosophy. The child read Tacitus and Descartes before most noblewomen of her age were taught to embroider. Her appearance also drew whispered commentary, broad shoulders, a slightly crooked back, and a husky voice. Eyewitnesses noted her masculine gait and disdain for court fashion. Christina refused to wear dresses and took delight in unsettling visitors by riding astride rather than side saddle. She later wrote with a touch of pride that nature had made her neither one thing nor the other. When Gustavus died in battle at Lutzen in 1632, the 6-year-old Christina became the heir to the Swedish throne. A regency council ruled in her name, but her education and political tutelage were meticulously managed. By age 18, she assumed full control of the state, yet it was clear that she resented the role. The rituals of monarchy bored her, and she was increasingly drawn to esoteric knowledge, art, and philosophy. Her court became a magnet for scholars, artists, and occultists, including the philosopher René Descartes, whose death from pneumonia in the frigid Stockholm palace marked a dark omen in Christina's story. Christina ruled during the tail end of the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict that had both elevated Sweden as a Protestant power and drained it economically. She negotiated the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, solidifying Swedish control over large swaths of northern Europe. But victory brought her little satisfaction. She began voicing discomfort with her role as queen, making cryptic remarks about false crowns and an empire of dust. She surrounded herself with Catholic converts, secretly read Jesuit writings, and alienated Protestant advisors. Her court, once seen as a beacon of intellectual life, became tense with uncertainty. Rumors abounded about her sexuality and temperament. Christina never married, insisting she found the idea of a husband repulsive. One French envoy described her as an Amazon by soul and spirit. Her closest relationships were with women, most notably Ebba Spare, whom she referred to as her bedfellow in intimate letters. This defiance of gender norms unsettled her nobles and created friction with the Lutheran clergy, already wary of her theological curiosity. By the early 1650s, Christina's mood had shifted from eccentricity to disillusionment. She suffered from migraines, violent fits of temper, and periods of withdrawal. Her behavior grew erratic, laughing hysterically during council meetings, walking the palace corridors at night, muttering prayers in Latin, and obsessing over the lives of Catholic saints. A disturbing anecdote from 1653 recounts her ordering a live peacock, brought to her chambers only to have it strangled in front of courtiers during a manic philosophical tirade on beauty and death. The final blow to her legitimacy came when she formally named her cousin Charles Gustav as heir. It was an unprecedented move made without a direct act of parliament. Her advisors were baffled. Christina responded with a cold indifference, declaring that she had done her duty to the state and would soon leave behind the madness of the world. Behind closed doors, she had already begun negotiations with the Vatican to convert to Catholicism. This was not merely a theological transformation, it was a seismic betrayal of Sweden's Protestant identity. Conversion meant forfeiting the throne and risking eternal exile from her homeland. But Christina seemed to revel in the risk. Her correspondence with the Jesuits revealed a growing belief that she was destined for a higher spiritual mission, one that defied national boundaries or earthly power. In early 1654, she began arranging for her abdication in secret. Only a handful of confidants were aware of her intentions. Even Charles Gustav was not fully informed of the date or nature of her departure. That spring, she made a series of mysterious visits to monasteries, commissioned strange allegorical paintings of queens, casting off their crowns, and ordered an extensive library of Catholic theology shipped to her private chambers. She stopped appearing in court for weeks at a time. Meanwhile, Stockholm buzzed with rumors that the queen had gone mad, that she was under foreign influence, or worse, that she had been possessed. One pamphlet circulated anonymously among the nobles claimed she slept beside a silver crucifix each night and practiced forbidden rites. Another accused her of making a pact with Rome to deliver Sweden into papal hands. The seeds of a terrifying transformation had been sown. Christina, born into a warrior king's legacy, had come to view the Swedish crown not as a symbol of glory, but as a prison. And she was preparing her escape through a door that led not just out of power, but into religious upheaval, political scandal, and ultimately infamy. On June 6, 1654, Queen Christina of Sweden staged one of the most bewildering abdications in European royal history. It unfolded in the city of Uppsala, in the very hall where her father had once been hailed as a Protestant hero. But instead of triumph, the scene carried an eerie solemnity tinged with elements of ritual more fitting for a funeral than a royal transition. The hall had been stripped of color. Christina entered wearing a plain white gown, devoid of regalia, as if preparing for martyrdom. Her crowned scepter and orb lay on a velvet cushion before her. Eyewitnesses noted that she appeared almost otherworldly silent, unmoving, her skin pale and eyes fixed beyond the assembled nobles. When the moment arrived, she stepped forward and without fanfare removed each symbol of sovereignty with her own hands. The crown was set down first, then the scepter. But it was the final gesture that unsettled even the most hardened courtiers. She untied her sword belt and placed the blade across the regalia, as if symbolically executing her own reign. What made this scene more unsettling was her voice. When she finally spoke, it was not with sadness or nostalgia, but with a calm indifference. I have no desire to rule again. I go to serve a greater master. There was no explanation, no elaboration, just a cryptic remark that deepened the unease in the room. Charles X. Gustav, her cousin, and now her successor, hesitated before approaching the throne. The ceremony lacked the jubilance of succession. No choirs sang, no drums rolled. Many present feared that the queen's abdication signaled divine judgment, or worse, a hidden betrayal. What followed compounded these fears. Within hours of abdicating, Christina vanished from the capital. She did not remain to witness the coronation of Charles X. Instead, she slipped away with a small entourage traveling south under heavy guard and deeper secrecy. Her route avoided major cities, bypassing key Protestant towns, and deliberately avoided public audiences. It was as though the queen feared exposure or assassination. Documents from this journey reveal a curious array of accompanying items, chests full of religious relics, forbidden books from the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, and even a reliquary said to contain the bone of an early Christian martyr. These artifacts had been quietly collected over years, smuggled into Sweden through diplomatic channels. Now they were bound for Rome. Christina adopted a false identity along the way, dressing in men's clothing and presenting herself as Count Dona, a supposed Swedish noble. This charade served not just to protect her from Protestant zealots, but also to mock the very idea of gendered roles that had confined her since childhood. She relished the freedom it gave her, writing later that she had never breathed more freely than while traveling as a man. In one particularly disturbing episode near the Baltic coast, Christina's party stopped at a Lutheran convent to rest. Local villagers claimed to have seen her burning pages from a psalter by candlelight, then replacing it with a crucifix she wore around her neck. A week later, that same convent suffered a mysterious fire. Though no link was ever proven, whispers followed her trail. Christina crossed into Denmark and made her way through German territories riddled with political and religious tension. Every stop required delicate maneuvering, bribery, and disinformation. The Holy Roman Empire's spies were watching, as were agents of Sweden, wary that she might stir rebellion or offer Swedish secrets to foreign powers. Yet no one could pin down her exact motives. Was she an apostate, a double agent, or merely a queen gone mad? Her arrival in Brussels in late 1654 marked a turning point. There, in the heart of Catholic Europe, she made her conversion public. The ceremony was clandestine, but unmistakably symbolic. In the crypt of the Cathedral of St. Gudula, surrounded by candlelight and cloaked priests, Christina formally renounced Lutheranism and took the name Maria Alexandra. Witnesses described a chilling moment after communion. She remained kneeling for an unusually long time, gripping the altar rail so tightly that her knuckles bled. The Pope, upon receiving news of her conversion, declared it a miracle of the North. Rome was elated. A Protestant monarch had not only renounced her faith, but done so voluntarily, without war, without coercion. Christina was hailed as a modern Constantine. But beneath the celebrations was a growing discomfort. She had arrived not as a penitent, but as a queen with unpredictable instincts. In the weeks that followed, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She made grand speeches in Latin to confused audiences, visited the sick in plague wards without protection, and gave away vast sums of money to alchemists, artists, and mystics. Her entourage became a peculiar court of exiles. Defrocked priests, failed poets, a French astrologer, and at least one former heretic from Naples. More disturbing still was her obsession with death. Christina visited crypts and catacombs wherever she went, often requesting to see decomposed remains or touch the bones of saints. In Cologne, she requested access to the Shrine of the Three Kings, but was found weeping uncontrollably and murmuring in broken Latin when the clergy arrived. One attendant later wrote that Her Majesty converses more freely with the dead than the living. By the end of 1654, she was no longer recognizable as the Queen of Sweden. Her abdication had not been an end, but a metamorphosis into something more dangerous, more unsettling, and wholly beyond the control of any court or creed. For the Swedish people, she had become a ghost, a vanished sovereign stripped from their chronicles but haunting their prayers. And for the Vatican, she had become a question without an answer. Would this convert be their shining champion, or a volatile reminder that faith and madness often shared the same mask? The journey from Protestant monarch to Catholic convert had stripped Christina of her kingdom, but not her hunger for power or spectacle. In early 1655, after months of drifting across Central Europe, in a theatrical haze of disguises and half-whispered confessions, she reached the city she had long envisioned as her spiritual homeland, Rome. Her arrival was unlike anything the Vatican had prepared for. On December 20th, Christina entered the Eternal City, not in solemn pilgrimage, but in operatic grandeur. Dressed in a dramatic black riding cloak, plumed hat, and men's boots, she rode on horseback, flanked by cardinals, trumpeters, and Roman nobility. The people of Rome had been ordered by papal decree to welcome her as a monarch, and thousands lined the streets uncertain whether to cheer or kneel. Some were struck by her masculine grace, others whispered about the unholy look in her eyes. Pope Alexander VII received her days later in a secret ceremony that mixed religious ecstasy with political theater. Christina was given a private mass in the chapel of St. Peter's, where she received communion as a Catholic for the first time. Official Vatican records described the moment as miraculous, but in the margins of one Jesuit account, a note read simply, "She trembled not." That detail, her eerie calm in a setting that made most converts weep, spread through the Curia like wildfire. The Vatican had hoped to present her as a royal trophy of Catholic triumph over northern heresy. Instead, they found themselves grappling with a woman who spoke Latin more fluently than many cardinals questioned theological doctrine at formal dinners and refused to adhere to papal etiquette. She dined with men. She refused a female companion. She appeared at masquerade balls dressed as Caesar. Within weeks, the Vatican began worrying about how to contain her. Christina took up residence in Palazzo Farnese, a lavish Roman estate lent to her by the Pope. There she established her own quasi-court, a hybrid of Renaissance salon, occult lodge, and diplomatic war room. She summoned musicians from Naples, playwrights from France, and exiled nobles from across Europe. The palace's halls rang with madrigals, philosophical debates, and cryptic Latin chants late into the night. But the glamour masked deeper eccentricities. Christina began commissioning portraits of herself in mythological forms, Minerva, Apollo, and even Lucifer. She spoke of reincarnation of divine missions of a secret brotherhood of kings, fated to return at the world's end. One diplomat described her as enthroned atop the ruins of her own mind. Beneath this growing instability lay a sharper, colder ambition. Christina had no intention of remaining a passive convert. She began inserting herself into papal politics, openly lobbying for French-aligned cardinals, criticizing the Inquisition's bureaucracy, and proposing alliances with Protestant defectors. She believed she could act as a mediator between religions, empires, and even heaven and earth. That belief soon took on disturbing tones. In the spring of 1656, she was reported visiting the catacombs beneath San Sebastiano, where she spent hours alone in the damp dark among the bones of early martyrs. One servant claimed she had spoken to the skull of a child saint, as if it were alive. When questioned, Christina dismissed it as prayer in its purest form. Her most persistent obsession, however, was the idea of forming a new kind of court, one not bound to any nation or church, but loyal to her alone. She offered positions to outcast philosophers censured by universities, heretics cast out by their churches, and women who claimed visions. She called them her chosen. No one knew how many answered. Some vanished. Others turned up later, raving or broken. One particularly chilling episode involved a young Jesuit scholar, Matteo Balestri, who had entered Christina's service to assist with her theological writings. Within months, he had become pale, withdrawn, and unwell. He was last seen leaving Palazzo Farnese, muttering about wheels of fire and a woman crowned in stars. Days later, his body was found in the Tiber, his hands bound with rosary beads. Rome, at first enthralled by the strange queen, from the north began to whisper. Stories spread of black masses, secret rooms in the palace, and a crucifix that bled when touched. The Vatican grew wary. Alexander VII restricted Christina's audience time. Her requests for new privileges were quietly delayed. She in turn responded with mocking poetry and political sabotage. Despite this growing alienation, Christina continued her self-styled mission. She believed her arrival in Rome was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of a transformation of religion, of monarchy of herself. She wrote feverishly revised scripture, debated with monks, and reportedly held seances. Her bedroom, it was said, smelled of incense and sulfur. In her letters, she invoked the language of revelation. She referred to herself as the anointed exile, as Sol Invicta, the unconquered sun. Whether she believed these titles or used them to intimidate her enemies remains unclear. What is certain is that she no longer saw herself as simply the former Queen of Sweden. By late 1656, Christina had burned most bridges with both Swedish nobility and the papal court. She had no state, no real income, and no formal power. But she retained one terrifying asset: unpredictability. No one could say what she would do next, or whether the church had embraced a saint, or invited in something far more dangerous. By 1657, Christina's transformation from monarch to mystic was complete in form, but not in consequence. No longer recognized as royalty by Sweden, and increasingly seen as a liability by the Vatican, she turned to the only court where she still wielded influence, her own. Now based in the Palazzo Riario in Trastevere, a sprawling, decaying Roman palace, thick with shadows and history, Christina ruled over a realm of illusion, performance, and psychological intensity. It would prove to be the crucible of her descent. The palazzo, though grand in reputation, was riddled with dampness, cracked frescoes, and echoing halls that lent the building a ghostly ambiance. Christina seemed to thrive in it. The drafty corridors became her stage, the peeling tapestries her backdrop. Her days began not with prayer or diplomacy, but with dramatic reenactments of scenes from ancient history. She would don robes declaim in Greek and demand her attendants address her as Pallas or Alexander. But beneath this theatricality was a more strategic vision. Christina was convinced she could still influence the political direction of Europe. She sought alliances with the French court, positioned herself as a mediator between Spain and the papacy, and offered her palace as neutral ground for secret negotiations. Her letters to Louis XIV brimmed with flattery, veiled threats, and metaphysical imagery. She called him the Son incarnate. And once proposed, their souls were bound from a past life. It was in this period that the most disturbing event of her post-abdication life occurred: the execution of Giovanni Monaldeschi, a former courtier confidant and possibly her lover. The details are still debated, but the official story began in Fontainebleau, France, where Christina had traveled in 1657, hoping to win favor with the young French king. There she learned that Monaldeschi had allegedly betrayed her, leaking sensitive documents to her enemies, and conspiring to discredit her among the Roman elite. Rather than bring the matter to French authorities, Christina took it into her own hands. On November 10, 1657, within the Galerie des Serres at the Château de Fontainebleau, Christina summoned Monaldeschi under the pretense of a private audience. As the stunned man entered the room, 3 guards, Swedish, not French, seized him. Christina accused him of treason and demanded a confession. The scene reportedly lasted hours. He wept, he begged, he offered to enter a monastery. Witnesses said Christina stood motionless as her guards stabbed him, once, then again, then a third time when he refused to die quickly. His blood soaked the polished floor. The murder of Monarchy caused a diplomatic scandal. The French court was outraged. Executing a foreign nobleman without trial on French soil was a flagrant violation of sovereignty. But Christina, ever unfazed by scandal, defended her actions in a written statement that read more like a philosophical tract than a justification. She claimed sovereigns retained the divine right of justice even in exile. "What I did," she wrote, "I did as queen." What unsettled her contemporaries most was not the act itself, but her serenity afterward. She dined as usual, she received guests, she went to Mass. When questioned about the bloodstains still visible in the gallery, she reportedly smiled and said, "They remind me of Rome." After the Monarchy affair, Christina's reputation in European courts collapsed. The Pope, though careful not to denounce her, directly cancelled several audiences. Louis XIV refused her further visits. Even her dwindling supporters in Sweden began referring to her as the Mad Queen of Trastevere. Yet within her palace walls, Christina seemed invigorated. She spoke more boldly, plotted more aggressively, and began redesigning her court with obsessive attention to ritual and hierarchy. She referred to her closest servants as disciples and required them to memorize arcane rules of etiquette based on a mix of Catholic liturgy and classical Roman customs. One chambermaid was reportedly dismissed for failing to bow in the Alexandrian manner. Visitors found themselves unnerved by the atmosphere mirrors, where covered clocks were moved, and rooms lit only by oil lamps or colored glass casting unnatural hues across the marble floors. Even stranger was her obsession with secret knowledge. She kept a locked study containing banned texts including grimoires, Talmudic fragments, and Hermetic scrolls. One French scholar who gained rare access to the room wrote that Christina had catalogued each text with annotations about resurrection purity and the reconciliation of masculine and feminine spirits. Some feared she was forming a cult. Others believed she was searching for a universal religion, a hidden truth beneath Christianity, Judaism, and paganism alike. But most simply kept their distance. Amid this surreal existence, Christina's body began to fail. She suffered severe joint pain, digestive ailments, and spells of breathlessness. Doctors were summoned, but she often dismissed their prescriptions in favor of remedies learned from mystics' powdered coral mercury tinctures and tinctures of lavender and opium. Her hair thinned. Her voice grew hoarser. She refused to admit weakness, and when asked about her health, would reply cryptically, "The body is clay. The soul burns brighter." Despite her decline, she continued writing feverishly, memoirs, treatises, letters to monarchs she no longer had access to. She drafted plans for a universal library, a religious order based on Plato, and a temple in Rome where art, science, and worship would be united. None came to fruition. The Palazzo Diario decayed with her. Decayed with servants left. Bills went unpaid. Dust gathered on half-finished sculptures. But she stayed increasingly alone, surrounded by relics of a vanished throne and visions of a destiny that only she believed in. By 1660, Queen Christina had become less a person and more a legend in the making. Rome still remembered her riding in like a sovereign, executing like an emperor, and now lingering like a ghost. By the early 1660s, Christina of Sweden had drifted so far from her identity as monarch that her actions began to resemble those of an autonomous inquisition answerable to no state, no court, and no moral order beyond her own. But the execution of Giovanni Monarchy was not an aberration. It was a glimpse into the deepening abyss of her psychology. Now isolated in Rome, she began projecting absolute power in smaller, more intimate, and more terrifying ways. After Monarchy's death, a subtle reign of fear began within the walls of Palazzo Diario. Servants no longer addressed Christina directly unless spoken to. She ordered the installation of spy holes and demanded detailed written reports on the behaviors, beliefs, and private conversations of every member of her retinue. These dossiers, dozens of which survive in archives, detail things as minor as missed morning prayers or facial expressions deemed skeptical. One valet was dismissed and possibly beaten for lingering too long in a chapel corridor. Another disappeared altogether after being caught copying down one of her philosophical treatises without permission. Christina herself remained convinced she was building something divine. She expanded her collection of relics and manuscripts, often through questionable channels. When she could not obtain originals, she commissioned counterfeits, and had them ceremonially authenticated by clergymen on her payroll. She began assigning sacred value to her possessions, a cracked mirror allegedly once belonging to Saint Teresa, a blood-stained glove she claimed was from a martyr of Lyon, and a section of bone said to be from a catacomb saint, though several scholars suspected it was from a pig. By 1665, the Pope and Curia had distanced themselves from her entirely, though they still granted her small pensions to avoid scandal. Officially, she remained a Catholic princess in exile. Unofficially, she was treated as a dangerous eccentric. Christina seemed to relish the ambiguity, writing to one cardinal that she was above the Pope and below the saints. Despite her eroding political standing, Christina continued to receive visitors, diplomats, nobles, heretics, and the occasional curious scholar. But each audience came with conditions. They must not question her about Sweden. They must bring a gift, ideally one of esoteric or symbolic significance. And they must tolerate her monologues, often hour-long lectures on metaphysics, fate, and the fusion of Platonic idealism with Christian sacrifice. One visitor described her as equal parts oracle queen and executioner. It was during this time that she became obsessed with purification rituals. Every room in her palace had to be blessed monthly. She hired a rotating cast of mystics and exorcists to walk the halls, chanting psalms in dead languages. One visitor swore he saw her kneeling before a flaming basin of incense arms outstretched, while two veiled women poured water over her hair and recited fragments of the Corpus Hermeticum. At the center of her spiritual delusions was the belief that she was chosen not metaphorically, but literally marked for a divine rebirth. She spoke often of the second throne, a mystical idea she claimed to have uncovered in the writings of Joachim of Fiore and obscure Eastern Christian sects. This throne, she said, was one not given by birthright or blood, but revealed only to those who had transcended suffering. It was, in her words, the seat of those who have died before dying. Her journals from this time become difficult to interpret, full of diagrams, Latin phrases, anatomical drawings, and apocalyptic visions. One entry depicts a circle labeled "the body" with arrows pointing inward to a black dot, "Nulla Regina no Queen." Another describes a dream where she walks barefoot across Sweden's frozen rivers, her skin flaking off until she becomes light without matter. Those around her feared she was losing touch with reality. But Christina remained functional, lucid in conversation, ruthless in finances, and astonishingly articulate in writing. This paradox confused her contemporaries. How could someone so clearly intelligent behave so irrationally? The answer perhaps lies in her relentless need to control meaning. Without a kingdom, without church support, and with no family left to anchor her, Christina created her own theology, one where she was both martyr and monarch prophet and punisher. Her loneliness deepened. She rejected all attempts at intimacy, even from her longtime favorite Cardinal Decio Azzolino, who remained her closest political ally. Their letters, once filled with strategic schemes and biting wit, grew sparse and cold. Christina began addressing him as "my watcher" rather than by name. When Azzolino expressed concern about her health, she accused him of spiritual weakness. Even her few acts of charity carried a morbid undertone. She endowed a hospital, but required that patients wear veils to obscure their identities. She funded a poorhouse, but had it adorned with sculptures of the Last Judgment. She gave money to nuns who cared for plague victims, but demanded that they sing the Dies Irae in her name each morning. The turning point came in 1668 when Christina attempted to establish an independent religious order. She drafted rules-designed vestments and even commissioned an emblem, a phoenix atop a crown submerged in water. The order would be celibate, philosophical, and hierarchical, answering to no earthly power. She called it Ordo Renovationis. Unsurprisingly, the Vatican refused to recognize it. When the denial came, Christina is said to have ripped the letter in half, burned it, and fasted for 3 days. During that time, she allegedly instructed her servants not to speak her name aloud. After this episode, even her most loyal allies distanced themselves. Visitors became rare. Her palace, once filled with strange life, began to fall silent. Furniture was left covered in sheets. Chandeliers remained unlit. Christina took to writing at night, wrapped in layers against the cold, her face lit only by oil lamps. She would sometimes speak to portraits, especially one of Gustavus Adolphus, whispering, "You chose wrong. You made me queen." By 1670, the woman who had once startled all of Europe with her abdication now lived as a recluse haunted not by her enemies, but by a kingdom that had never truly known her. Yet even in that solitude, Christina remained dangerous. Her mind was a cathedral of obsessions and her soul a battlefield where sovereignty and sanctity tore each other apart. The final years of Christina's life, spent almost entirely within the crumbling grandeur of Palazzo Riario, were marked by decay in every sense: political, physical, psychological. The palace itself had become a physical metaphor for its mistress, once grand. Now mold-stained and dimly lit, its courtyards overgrown with weeds, and its corridors echoing with the footfalls of vanishing servants. Visitors described the interior as both majestic and suffocating tapestries, rotting in the damp air, sacred relics displayed beside broken statuary, and doors that no longer closed properly. Yet Christina insisted on staying. By 1672, she had outlived many of her contemporaries. Her longtime correspondent and political ally, Cardinal Azzolino, remained her only real connection to the papal world, though even he now visited infrequently. Christina's reputation across Europe had faded into a blur of rumor and irrelevance. Some believed she had gone insane. Others imagined her as a kind of mystical recluse, perhaps holy, perhaps heretical. The Vatican, always cautious, maintained her title as a Catholic princess, but no longer supported her financially with any enthusiasm. Much of her income now came from the sale of artworks and rare manuscripts she once collected with obsessive pride. Her health, too, was failing. She suffered from chronic pain in her joints and abdomen, likely the result of decades of mercury-based alchemical treatments and self-medicated opiates. Eyewitnesses reported that she walked with difficulty, leaning on canes covered in velvet and silver. Her fingers were misshapen and swollen. Her eyesight had deteriorated, and she relied on assistants to read to her from memory. Still, she refused the presence of doctors unless they were trained in what she called the divine arts, a euphemism for hermetic medicine and spiritual healing. Christina became increasingly consumed with preparation for death, though not in any conventional sense. She rejected standard Catholic rites. Instead, she developed her own ritual of passage, a blend of classical and Christian symbols. She instructed her remaining household to burn certain documents upon her death, including several volumes of personal writings, some labeled Testamentum Lux, the Testament of Light. Others were more disturbing. A sealed letter addressed to whomever is King of Sweden reportedly contained a tirade against the Lutheran Church, a denunciation of her family line, and cryptic references to a reversal of thrones in a coming age. Perhaps most unsettling was her obsession with relics, particularly her own. In 1673, she summoned a Roman artisan to design a reliquary to hold a lock of her hair, her baptismal ring, and what she referred to as the uncorrupted tooth, one of her own molars removed during a feverish illness. She insisted these be preserved in a sealed chest for the illumination of future generations. A notary present at the commissioning was so disturbed by her language that he asked to be excused from further service. Christina also began conducting rehearsals for her funeral. These were not symbolic gestures. She would lie in bed dressed in ceremonial robes while her attendants read excerpts from both the Book of Job and fragments of Euripides. She demanded silence throughout the ritual and insisted her body be anointed not only with holy oil, but with a compound of lavender ash and crushed marble to preserve the regal shell, as she put it. By January 1689, her condition had worsened. She suffered what may have been a stroke or series of small seizures. Her speech slurred. She hallucinated frequently, calling out to her father and the saints she had once mocked. Her last letters to Azzolino were rambling and repetitive, referring constantly to a divine unfolding and expressing disappointment that the Vatican had never allowed her to lead a crusade of pure minds. The final illness came swiftly. On April 16th, Christina collapsed in her study after reportedly spending hours rereading her Latin translation of the Book of Daniel. She was moved to her bedchamber where a Jesuit priest was summoned, but she refused to confess, instead asking to be read verses from Seneca and Psalm 88. "I am no sinner," she muttered. "I am a queen who has descended." Her death, which occurred on April 19th, 1689 at the age of 62, was anything but serene. Her final breaths were labored, accompanied by a rasping sound that terrified the attendants. One chambermaid fainted. Another fled the room, later claiming to have seen a shadow cross the wall just as the queen died. Immediately after her death, chaos ensued. The Vatican, unsure of how to proceed, dispatched officials to oversee the preservation of her body. The results were bizarre. A public autopsy was conducted, an uncommon practice for royalty at the time, supposedly to settle rumors about her gender and health. Her corpse was dissected at Santo Spirito Hospital, and the internal organs removed for burial in a separate container. Some reports claim these organs were never found again. The rest of her body was embalmed and treated with a mix of wax resin and spices, then placed in a coffin draped in purple velvet. She was given a full Catholic burial, not because the Church revered her, but because it could not risk alienating the powerful families connected to her legacy. She was buried in the grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica, an extraordinary honor rarely extended to women, let alone foreign monarchs. She lies there still among the popes. But Rome did not mourn her. Whispers spread that her soul wandered the corridors of Palazzo Riario. A few servants refused to return. Visitors to her former apartments described sudden chills and the smell of scorched incense. Her journals, those that survived, were sealed by the Inquisition and not made public for nearly 2 centuries. Christina's legacy, at least officially, was reduced to a theological anomaly, a Protestant queen who embraced Rome but lived as something neither saint nor sinner. And in death as in life, she remained an enigma, unclaimed by her homeland, mistrusted by her adopted faith, and remembered only in fragments of ink and rumor. The strange death of Queen Christina did little to resolve the controversies that had haunted her in life. In fact, it birthed new ones. From the moment her embalmed body was lowered into the crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a place traditionally reserved for popes and saints, her legacy became the subject of fascination, suspicion, and quiet revulsion. The Vatican, already uneasy about having granted her such honors, soon found itself grappling with the implications of what it had allowed into its sacred vaults. The autopsy conducted days after her death had confirmed some medical details Christina suffered from a combination of arthritis, gallstones, and chronic gastrointestinal problems. But more salaciously, it also reignited an old rumor that the queen had not been fully female. Anatomical notes from the dissection circulated quietly among Vatican medical circles reported the presence of unusually developed musculature, a masculine frame, and ambiguous genitalia. While modern historians caution against drawing conclusions based on 17th century anatomical language, the suggestion that Christina was intersex, or at the very least hormonally atypical, was enough to spark decades of speculation. That detail was not made public until the 18th century, when one physician, Giovanni Battista Morgagni, referenced the case anonymously in a medical treatise. But within Rome, the rumor spread quickly. To some, it explained everything: her refusal to marry her masculine clothing, her rejection of domestic roles. To others, it added a new layer of blasphemy: Christina had been buried among the popes, yet may not have been a true woman. It became quietly a source of ecclesiastical shame. Adding to the unease was her peculiar request that no permanent monument be raised over her grave. Instead, she asked that her name be spoken, rather than carved a statement as cryptic as it was theatrical. For decades, her tomb remained unmarked, shielded behind other sarcophagi in the papal grottos. Only in the 20th century was a formal inscription added under pressure from Swedish diplomats. But even before that, Christina had already begun to haunt the intellectual and religious landscape of Europe. Her unpublished writings, those that survived the ritual burnings she ordered, revealed a mind increasingly entangled in spiritual synthesis and metaphysical rebellion. In Testamentum Lux, for example, she proposes a cosmology where monarchy is a divine burden, assigned at birth, meant to be cast off through suffering and self-annihilation. In another fragment, she describes the Eucharist not as a sacrament, but as an alchemical union of matter and soul, wherein bread becomes symbol and symbol becomes sovereign. Some of these documents were suppressed by the Church, others circulated privately, especially among Enlightenment thinkers. Voltaire mentioned Christina in his letters with guarded respect, calling her a woman born too early for her revolution. In Sweden, where she remained a disgraced figure for generations, nationalist historians eventually reclaimed her as a visionary, albeit a misguided one. Still, official Swedish genealogies treated her reign as an interruption, not a legacy. More peculiar was the cult of fascination that grew up around her person in occult and esoteric circles. By the 19th century, mystics in France and Germany began referencing her as a spiritual martyr, someone who had tried and failed to reconcile the divided truths of East and West masculine and feminine Protestant and Catholic. A sect of Swedish Rosicrucians even claimed that she had faked her death and lived on in secret, founding an underground order of luminous minds. While such claims are patently false, they speak to the psychological intensity of Christina's story. She had become in death a canvas onto which generations projected their own anxieties about power, gender, and belief. Her life defied the categories that structured the 17th century. She was a queen who scorned queenship, a Catholic who defied the church, a woman who rejected womanhood, and a ruler who chose to unrule herself. One of the strangest posthumous rituals took place in 1820 when her bones were exhumed during a reorganization of the papal tombs. The remains were reportedly intact, preserved better than expected. Some described the skull as broad, almost Roman. A priest present at the reinterment was said to have whispered, "She looks like one of the emperors." Whether he meant it as awe or warning is unclear. Even into the modern age, Christina's grave remained a subject of uneasy reverence. Tourists visiting St. Peter's rarely recognize her name among the line of pontiffs. Guides mention her briefly, if at all. But her presence there, sealed in stone and obscured by history, continues to trouble the architecture of Catholic memory. And yet Christina herself would have likely approved. In life, she demanded attention by destabilizing every identity imposed on her. In death, she achieved something rarer. She inserted herself into a lineage she did not belong to, claimed honors she was not due, and forced a reckoning that remains unresolved. She once wrote, "Let the tomb hold my bones, but not my truth. That must wander." It does. Long after Christina's body was sealed beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica, her life continued to echo in ways that neither the Vatican nor Sweden could predict or fully contain. If her contemporaries had struggled to make sense of her, an abdicated queen turned Catholic mystic, ruling over a court of misfits and relics, then the centuries that followed would render her not only controversial, but strangely prophetic. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Enlightenment values clashed with rising Romanticism, Christina's contradictions became fertile ground for new interpretations. Philosophers admired her intellect. Dramatists exaggerated her madness. In 1753, the German writer Gotthold Ephraim Lessing published a fictional dialogue in which Christina debated Descartes in the afterlife, accusing him of chaining the mind to reason while she had sought its fire. Others compared her to Shakespeare's Hamlet, a sovereign, paralyzed not by indecision but by an overwhelming awareness of absurdity. Sweden, meanwhile, maintained an uncomfortable silence. Christina's abdication had ushered in a period of military conquest under Charles Sachtag, followed by decades of empire and collapse. She was rarely celebrated, never officially condemned. Her portraits were removed from royal galleries. Her name appeared in textbooks as a footnote to dynastic disruption. But this erasure could not be complete. The Swedish Academy of Sciences quietly preserved several of her scientific correspondences, and her patronage of early Swedish printing was later acknowledged in historical retrospectives. By the 20th century, the world had caught up with many of Christina's taboos. Her rejection of traditional gender roles, her fluid presentation of self, and her radical questioning of religious orthodoxy earned her a new audience, one less concerned with royalty and more with identity. Feminist scholars began to re-examine her writings, tracing the contours of a life lived in defiance of expectations. Queer theorists reclaimed her refusal to marry her intimate relationships with women, and her deliberate androgyny as revolutionary. One especially revealing document discovered in 1937 in the Vatican's Archivio Segreto included a personal prayer Christina had written in the final months of her life. It reads not as a plea for salvation, but as a meditation on power. "If God made me queen, he did not mean for me to remain so. My rule was meant to reveal its own emptiness that men might see. No throne is more sacred than a soul that dares to be sovereign over itself." This belief that monarchy, gender, and even faith were constructs to be transcended was utterly foreign to the 17th century. But to the modern world, Christina's metamorphosis seemed eerily familiar, a life lived in rebellion against the constraints of nation, church, body, and history. Still, not all modern interpretations are flattering. Some historians frame her legacy in terms of hubris and delusion. Her governance of Sweden was often erratic. Her religious conversion alienated both allies and enemies. Her so-called court in Rome disintegrated into a disordered household of sycophant spies and occult charlatans. Her treatment of Monarchy remains a chilling reminder of how absolute power, however self-fashioned, can turn cruel. But it is this very blend of ambition and collapse that makes Christina compelling. She embodies the violent friction between inner conviction and external reality. Her failure was never in vision, but in execution. She attempted to become more than a queen, to be philosopher, priest, artist, sovereign, and soul, but ended up haunted by the fragments she could not fuse. Her burial among popes, far from being the end of her story, became its strangest punctuation. No other woman, no deposed monarch, no lay convert rests among the patriarchs of the church in that crypt. Her presence remains a silent challenge, a body not supposed to be there, a voice that continues to unsettle the narrative of sacred succession. And even today, when visitors pass through the gloom of St. Peter's underground chambers, past the ornate tombs of Gregory and Leo, they may pause before a name carved in simple Latin: Christina Regina Suecorum, Queen of the Swedes. No epitaph explains why, because Christina never belonged entirely to Sweden nor to Rome. She existed on a jagged edge between worlds never truly accepted by any, yet incapable of being forgotten by all. In the centuries since her death, Queen Christina of Sweden has eluded historical closure. Her life resists neat categories, frustrating generations of biographers, theologians, and historians who sought to place her within a traditional framework of monarchs, saints, or madwomen. She was none of these things fully, and perhaps that is precisely what made her so dangerous to the order of her time. Born into the height of Swedish Protestant power, she rejected its crown, its religion, and its vision for her future. She chose exile over obedience, obscurity over decorum. Her reign ended not with death or defeat, but with a voluntary dismantling of monarchy itself. At a time when rulers clung to thrones as divine mandates, Christina walked away, and not quietly. She forced open the boundaries between masculine and feminine, sacred and profane power and abandonment. Whether she was fleeing expectations or hunting for a deeper truth is still debated. What is clear is that Christina saw the world not as a stage for performing inherited roles, but as a forge for reshaping the self through suffering, exile, and sometimes cruelty. To her contemporaries, she was a scandal. To her successors, a ghost. To the church, a tolerated anomaly. But to the modern imagination, she has become something more complex, a symbol of defiance, of interior sovereignty, of the cost of living authentically in a world built on rigid order. The terrifying nature of Christina's final days was not in their violence or decay, but in their intensity. She stared directly at the hollow core of monarchy faith and identity and refused to look away. In doing so, she became a mirror for all who would dare to question their place in history's design. Christina remains quite literally entombed in the heart of Catholic tradition, but her spirit does not rest. It continues to provoke, to unsettle, and to whisper from the margins, "Rule yourself or be ruled."